Welcome to the Doggy Stars podcast, our podcast about service dogs, dog training, and disabilities. Today, we are going to be talking about fear and desensitization. So, of course, our first thing is, what is desensitization? So, when we say the term desensitization, what we mean is that we're lessening the response to a fearful situation, or it can be a reactive situation as well, but today I want to focus on fear. So desensitization is lessening that response, as opposed to sensitization, where we increase the response to a fearful situation. Now, normally you never want to sensitize, have sensitization, but it's a good term to know and to use just because it can happen on accident. And then, of course, we also have counter conditioning. Normally, desensitization and counter conditioning go hand in hand. So counter conditioning is changing the response to a fearful situation, as opposed to desensitization is lessening that response. Counter conditioning is changing the response. So normally you'll hear, we're going to do desensitization and counter conditioning. So we'll talk about counter conditioning a little bit, but I really wanted to focus on fear and that kind of thing today. So just an example, sort of the difference between these three terms is, let's say your dog is afraid of big, large people, which is a very common fear for dogs, especially smaller dogs. So you could sensitize the dog by, the large man comes in, you hold them still, or you hand the dog off to the person, and this dog is trembling in fear, and they're going to learn this is a scary thing, that response is going to increase. Now, instead, we desensitize the dog to this fear, hopefully, is you start at a distance, and you reward the calm. So the dog's calm, you reward them. And then you decrease that distance a little bit, wait for the dog to be calm, reward that, etc. Now, counter conditioning would be, you have that dog, you're decreasing the distance, but instead of just rewarding the calm, you're teaching the dog to look up at you. So the dog is calm and looks up at you, then they get the reward. So they're learning a different response than trembling in fear. So, those are the important terms for today: desensitization, sensitization, and counter conditioning. So, with dogs, we have several fear periods, which are really important things at their different ages. So, in the first 4 months, we have a critical socialization period, which is very important because they need to be socialized to all kinds of things. If they're not socialized to something, they interact with it later in their life. They could have a fear response. Not always, of course, but they could. And then between about 6 months and 18 months is what we have a fear period, or fear periods, multiple, where the dog will be going along and just all of a sudden it's just like that. They're afraid of something. And it doesn't even have to be something. Of course, there are fears where, let's say the mop falls and nearly hits the dog, then they might be a little more afraid of the mop for a little while. Now, during one of these fear periods, there's a much higher chance of them being afraid, and it might take longer to decrease, to desensitize to the mop. But they also might just suddenly be afraid of that mop, even though nothing ever happened. During these fear periods, that's just one of the things that happens. So you have to be really aware of your dog, watching their responses. And of course, later in life, it's always possible for them to become afraid of something as well, whether it's, because there's a reason or not. Some dogs are just more sensitive than others, and they're just more likely to become afraid of these things. Of course, it's completely normal for dogs to just be afraid of things, whether it's suddenly or whether it's that sudden fear that makes no sense, or something happened. Unfortunately, your dog got attacked by a black dog. Now they're afraid of black dogs. It's completely normal for dogs to have these fears, and how we help them is desensitization and counter conditioning. So you have to be very, very careful when your dog is afraid of something that you're not sensitizing them to anything. So you never want to force your dog into a situation when they're afraid. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on that. If they're a little bit afraid of something, like they're just like, what is that? And then they're like, oh, I'm cool. You might be able to just sort of introduce them to the thing and they're fine. However, we want to talk about these things where the dogs are a little more afraid. They're like, I don't want to deal with that. Or they're shaking, or they're cowering. Those ears go back. Any of those kinds of bigger fears. They're not even major fears necessarily, but just slightly bigger fears. We want to desensitize them too. So the sensitization, is if you're going to force them into it, which we never want to do. So if this is the thing your dog is afraid of, you're not going to pull on their collar, their leash, and drag them over. You don't want to just go put them on the thing. Because that can actually make the fear much, much worse, and we don't want to do that. So you have to be really careful. We never want to sensitize our dogs to these things. So instead, we want to desensitize them to these fearful things. So it's really important that you're going to work at your dog's own pace. So, if your dog one day is fine going, a couple of feet away from the scary thing, and then the next day they're only okay being 3 feet away, that's fine. Work at their own pace. Don't push them too much. Because if you're pushing them, you could sensitize them to the fear. So it's just really important that you're not pushing them too much. However, of course, in order to desensitize them, they have to experience the fear. So the experience is you bring them to the point where they're showing the very, very beginning signs. You don't want them trembling, tail tucked, crouched. But just they're kind of like they're side-eyeing the object or the thing. Like if it's other dogs, large people, like I said earlier, they're just kind of like side-eyeing it. They're watching it intently. You bring them up to that point, and then you're going to wait. And you want to wait for them to relax. Whether that's looking away from the thing, looking up at you is great, because that's part of that counter conditioning I mentioned earlier, teaching them a different behavior to the fearful situation. Their ears relax, their tail maybe goes from tucked, hopefully not too tucked. Remember, we don't want them in really tense. But like just a little bit under the legs to relaxed. You look for that calm response. You're seeing that. That's when you're going to go ahead and give them a reward. And you want it to be, something really great. Yay, you get bacon. Or something like that. They get that great treat, and then you can even turn and walk away so that they're no longer near that fear. You're actually extra rewarding them because they're like, oh, hey, I calmed down and I got to go further away from the thing I'm afraid of. And so you keep doing this. And the idea is when they're calm to start at whatever distance you started, you go a little bit closer. Again, looking for minor signs of stress. And then you can go ahead, wait for the calm, reward the calm, and, even leave once they're showing that. So and of course it's really important to be careful here. We don't want to sensitize our dogs. So one of the things is, like I said earlier, go at your dog's own pace. So that also depends on what the fear is. If the fear is cars, that can be really hard. You don't want to take that dog to a busy parking lot because you really can't get far enough away easily from all these cars that they're afraid of. You're actually going to sensitize them. That fear level is going to increase, that response is going to increase because they're fearful, this fearful thing is all around them. If the fear is cars, instead you'd want to say, maybe go to a park where there's a parking lot, but you can quickly get away from those cars, start at a distance, and also those cars aren't going to be moving. They're not, for the most part, they're not going to have loud engines, hopefully for the most part. So you can start at a distance and slowly work your way back in. Of course, in order to get to the park, you might have to use a car, which, brings the whole sensitization thing back up again. So you have to be careful there. But it depends. So if they're afraid of other dogs, or maybe a specific type of dog, like I mentioned earlier, maybe they were attacked by a black dog, now they're afraid of black dogs. Maybe they're just nervous around all types of dogs. Doing something like going by a dog park, now you would not go into the dog park. That would be a terrible idea if your dog is afraid of or nervous around other dogs. But you go to, by a dog park and you start 50 feet out. And if that's not far enough for your dog, then start 100 feet out, Start out at the distance that works for your dog. But then you would go from 100 feet to maybe 90 feet. And if your dog's come at 90 feet, you'd come into 80 feet. And eventually, one day, you're going to be able to go right up to that dog park. Now, depending on the dog, the situation, you may or may not be able to go into the dog park. But eventually, one day, if you're taking it slow, you'll be able to go right up to the dog park. Now, that brings up another point that I was just saying, is one day. You're not going to be able to go from 100 feet away from a dog park to right next to a dog park in one day. It takes a lot of time to truly desensitize, which is part of why we do desensitization and counter conditioning, because by changing the fearful response to something else, like looking up at you, it helps the dog get through it a little faster. As opposed to the desensitization just lessening the response can take a very, very long time on its own. Now, with that said, counter conditioning also takes time, just sometimes a little less. But it will take, depending on how strong that fear is, it's going to take days or weeks. If it's a really strong fear, it may take months to be able to get through it, to lessen that response, change the response if you're doing counter conditioning, to the point where the dog can be comfortable around a thing again. So, and of course, this is for all types of fears, like I said, big fears, small fears, fear of the mailman. Now, with that said, most dogs who bark at the mailman are not afraid of the mailman. They're excited because the mailman's here. Or it's more of a protective, this is my space, I don't want you here. You can desensitize and counter condition to those responses as well. So a very common situation for desensitization and counter conditioning is a dog reactive dog. What that means is, so I was talking about fear. This one is more of a reaction. So a dog reactive dog, as an example, is, a dog on leash normally, on leash, sees another dog, and they start barking, bouncing up and down, maybe pulling at the leash, trying to get to that other dog. So that's that reactive dog. And you can also desensitize and counter condition for that. And that one's often, dog reactivity is often a lot easier to work with, because it's very easy to control, especially if you have a friend or a trainer with a dog. So you start at that distance, and if the dog is barking and lunging, it's too close, you go further back. Wait for your dog to be paying attention to the other dog, but they're okay. Reward the calm, that's the desensitization. And then counter conditioning becomes especially important. You teach them to look at you. Once they look at you, you can turn away and walk away. Then you move that little bit closer. Again, just until there's that little bit of response. Wait for the calm, reward that, walk away. And it takes time. I worked with a very reactive dog once who was, she would scream, it literally sounded like a scream, not a bark. She would scream and she'd be pulling at her leash so bad she'd go up onto her back 2 feet. And this was a dog who you were afraid of if you saw this. Now, she was not aggressive. It was 100% just that, I want to play. But it was way that response. She had gotten sensitized to it. That response to the situation just been increased till she was out of control. And it took us months. It took us several months to start desensitizing her and working on that counter conditioning. But it works. And we were very careful to, if you accidentally, that's one thing. If you accidentally get too close to one of these triggers for your dog, you can always do basically what's called a U-turn. Turn and walk the other way as quickly as possible. You don't have your treats with you one day or a toy. Your dog is afraid of other dogs. You're out on a walk. You thought there were no other dogs around and suddenly there's a dog. Oops, we're going to go the other way. Because you want to be careful, like I said, about sensitization. The more they have a chance to practice that response, whether it's fearful or reactive or whatever, the more likely they are to do that response. And it could get worse. That's what the sensitization is. So you really want to be careful as much as possible with fear. With desensitization, you want to introduce things slowly in a controlled manner so that you can, over time, lessen that response and hopefully get it to the point where they're no longer afraid of that situation. All right. So one of the things here is, just as that reminder, it is completely normal for our dogs to have fears, whether they come on suddenly or not. It is much more likely in a younger dog to have those random, fear periods where just things pop up. But whenever these come up, try to work with your dog. It's very easy. I have accidentally sensitized my dog to things sometimes, and then I have to stop everything, go all the way back, and start desensitizing and counter conditioning. And it's a lot harder the second time around than the first time. If you just catch it the first time, when they're just starting to be afraid of something, it's much easier to desensitize. If you start sensitizing your dog and increasing that response, it becomes much harder to then decrease that response again because they've practiced it and they're like, oh, I know what I do in this situation. I get afraid, or whatever their reaction is. One dog I worked with is a poor, I think it was an Aussie mix. This poor thing, when I met her, she was shaking and terrified of everything. She was afraid of her own shadow. Because when she was about 6 to 8 months, her owner was thinking along the old methods and was like, well, my dog is afraid of this crate. Or I think, it was a gate. Like those metal gates you have she's afraid of this gate. I'm going to pull her over and force her to get used to this. And so the dog started getting afraid of that metal gate. And she started learning, like, I don't know if I can trust this person because she's going to make these fears harder. They're going to be worse. And then now this dog was sensitized to this gate and was just sort of sensitized in general. Unfortunately, it's kind of a sensitive breed. And then started showing some fear around, I think, the crate maybe, or around the kitchen, something like that. And again, the owner dragged the dog over and was like, you're gonna get used to this. And the dog just got sensitized. That fear response got worse and worse and started to generalize to other things. And by the time this dog came into me, she was a wreck. She was afraid of everything. She didn't even want to walk on the floor. It was a tile floor. She did not want to walk on the floor. She didn't want to do anything. And it was a fight to desensitize this dog. We did it slowly. I only got to work with her for maybe like a month and a half or so. So hopefully the work continued after I stopped working with her. But it was so hard because this dog was so sensitized to not just one thing, but so many things that became very hard to desensitize her. And a lot of it was just going into building that trust again. So you just have to be really careful about sensitization. You don't want to increase that fearful response. You don't want to force. There's a term that is used in human experiences is exposure therapy. You know, if you're afraid of airplanes, going on an airplane, you see a lot of pictures of airplanes. Then you go to the airport, sit in the parking lot. Then well, anymore you can't go up to the gate. You haven't been able to do that for years, but you go into the waiting area around all the people. Then you book a flight and you actually go on a flight even though you're terrified of planes. And as a human, you can think through all of this, and the exposure therapy can work because you're like, okay, well, I'm being exposed to this thing I'm afraid of, but I'm not actually coming to harm. I feel like I'm gonna die, but I didn't die. I'm not going to die. For our dogs, who can be very smart in their own ways, they don't think the same way. So if, say, we had a dog afraid of airplanes and we tried to do the same thing with, like, we play airplane sounds and then we bring them to the lobby and we bring them on an airplane. Now, of course, only some dogs are allowed on airplanes. I want to make sure I say that. But it's very possible, if you went at the same speed as a human would go through, you'd be going too fast. You'd have to go very slowly. You'd probably start with that airplane sound, very small, slowly increase it if the dog recognizes that that's the sound of an airplane. Honestly, bringing them to the lobby of an airport wouldn't necessarily do anything because in the dog's mind, it's not connected to the airplane. Maybe, going to a local park where a lot of airplanes go overhead, you could work on the desensitization. But because you can't control it, it's a lot harder. So we don't really use exposure therapy or flooding, where you just, the person who's afraid of spiders puts their arm into a container of spiders, which is called flooding, just overwhelming the senses with the thing. You don't want to do that for dogs. You want to make sure that you're going slowly with them, you're going at that pace for them. Hopefully it's as controlled as possible, especially at the beginning, because it's very easy for, okay, well, we're working with the car that's parked down the street and suddenly another car drives by us. So trying to control it as much as possible, trying not to increase that fear. Can be hard. It does work. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience. All right, I think I've covered a lot on fear and desensitization, and I covered a little bit on counter conditioning. If you have any questions, obviously you can always ask in chat if you catch us live, or you can send us a message at doggystars.org. That's DOGGYSTARS.org. Or our email is doggystarsblog@gmail.com. You can always send us messages there, comments, questions, whatever you have. We're happy to cover a variety of topics, of course, on service dogs, dog training, or disabilities are our main focuses. And we're happy to answer your questions, and we'd love to see your comments. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to having you with us another day.